Thanks for the little intro, Jono. Not sure if I deserve that much of a rap, but yeah, he was right about one thing. I'm packing it up here. This is definitely the most people have had to talk in front of, so bear with me. I've practiced what I need to say a million times at home, but I'm sure I'll have a few little mind blanks. Yeah, basically just going to talk about dewey fishing, predominantly in the Lake Macquarie and the Newcastle area. I'm not going to go over everything involved with catching jewfish because, as I'm sure you all know, there's a million things, water temperature, time of year, all that sort of stuff. And there's definitely a couple of much more intelligent people that need to get up and talk after me, so I don't want to hold them up. I'm going to focus on probably what I think is the most important thing to catching jewfish, probably the hardest thing for people new to fishing and particularly new to jewfishing. Might struggle with wrapping their head around in the early stages, and that's getting your head around the tides. I can see a lot of really experienced guys in the room tonight that probably already know a lot about what I'm going to talk about. This is more about me shedding a bit of light on some of the things I've learnt that might help the new guys into not just fishing but particularly jew fishing. Yeah, shedding a bit of light on some of the stuff that I've learnt about the tides and catching jewies. So we'll start right at the basics. Can anyone tell me what is the biggest impact on what creates the tides? Moon. I think he said it first. Johnny, anyone got a packet of lures? This gentleman... Neither of those gentlemen said it. So yeah, I'll get him on later. I'll get you on later, mate. It's all good. So yeah, the moon determines what the tides do. This is why you hear some people say full moon's great for dewey fishing, and you'll hear another bloke say no, the new moon's good for dewey fishing. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just as simple as some areas fish better with bigger tides and more water moving through that area, and other spots fish better with smaller amount of water moving through the area. I've got a lot of mates that carve it up on the rocks and on the beaches and stuff, and they love the full moon for dewies. Me here personally in Lake Macquarie, I have a lot more success fishing the new moon for dewies, and a lot of that is in summer too when it coincides with the prawn run. That definitely gets them feeding. So basically the tides will run in for roughly 6 hours. That does depend on how big the tides are, but roughly 6 hours. Then they slow right up, they become very still, and then they'll start to trickle back out the other side. Now that period is what we all love to call the tide change, the big infamous tide change that everyone speaks of. It runs back out the other way for 6 hours, goes into another tide change, so on and so forth, and it does this all day, all night. Now a big misconception that I often hear people make when it comes to dewey fishing is they say you've got to be fishing the tide change, and a lot of people take that literally like you need to be fishing during that 40-minute window where the tide is changing. It's not necessarily the case. I've got a lot of mates that do really well down on the Hawkesbury River, mainly live baiting for the dewies, but they'll fish like the last 4 hours of the tide or the first 4 hours of a tide. When it starts to change, when it starts to become very still, the boat will swing around a lot or their lines start getting tangled. They actually don't like that 40-minute period. A lot of the good dewey fishermen that fish very tidal waterways, specifically with bait, they'll use that 40 minutes to reposition their boat. They'll get all their gear in, they'll go and move to another area of the river, and they'll fish there on the other for another 4 hours on the other side of the tide. So that's another important thing to point out too. You will find spots that fish really good on the run-in tide, but they might not be that good on the run-out tide, and vice versa. So it's up to us as anglers to, take note of our favourite spots and then just figure out exactly what part of the tide, whether it's a run-in or the run-out, that these particular spots fish the best. Right, just checking my notes because I am probably more of a fisherman than a public speaker. So, rightio. So, yeah, something that really outlined to me a while ago, really painted a really good picture as to what part of the tide these fish really like to feed on was there was a big white spot outbreak in the Hunter River a few years ago. And all the prawns got white spot and they had to ban commercial fishing for a long time. I don't know how long it was, but it was long enough to start noticing big changes in the ecosystem. We started seeing freshwater shrimp with the big nippers making it all the way down to like Stockton boat ramp, and prawns everywhere, and the jewfish were loving it. we started off having some amazing sessions, and my mates and I, we were really taking the piss here, having sickies, everything, going in there every afternoon. And, started off having sessions of 10, 12, 14 dew fish in an afternoon. It ended up getting out of control. I've got my mate Liam in the audience here. He'd never caught a dewie on lure, and he jagged it one arvo. I took him in and had the best session I've had in there, and we spun 44 up in one afternoon. This was insane. So while we had these conditions where the fish were just feeding their heads off, and we were fishing a very tidal waterway like the Hunter River, where you can visibly look at eddies and watch what stage the tide's at, and you can see it change very clearly. It's a bit harder to see what's exactly going on in the lake, but while we were fishing a very tidal waterway and the fish were playing ball, like they were going nuts, it was really easy for us to see exactly what part of the tide they did fire up. So some days we'd get out there a bit early and we'd be in the middle of the tide and we wouldn't be catching all that many fish. But surely enough, around that 2-hour mark before the tide change, that's when we started getting, we'd watch the bite rate just start to increase, start to creep up. We'd get a fish every 10 minutes, then we'd get a fish every 5 minutes. About an hour before the tide changed, it was nearly a fish a cast. It was going crazy. But then the funny thing was, and something that probably would shock a lot of people, is as it really slowed back down again and the water became very still, the bites really dropped off. It should probably be a beer, Jono. But so yeah, right on that slack water, the bites did really drop off. And then sure enough, we'd wait and we'd start to see the eddies form on the other side of the structure, and we'd move the boat around, and 40 minutes later we'd be throwing into the eddies on the other side, we'd start catching fish again, the bite rate would pick up and would be on. And then as it got too fast, the bite rate would really drop off again. So I guess the main thing I'm trying to point out here is you don't need to stress too much about fishing right on that 40-minute tide change. It's more the 2 hours either side of the tide change. This wasn't just one afternoon or one session where we found that slack water, the bite drop off. This was like months and months of fishing that happened every single time. It sort of coincides with one of the old school sayings, especially a lot of snapper guys. I know a lot of snapper fishers swear by the saying of no run, no fun. And it's pretty much what I'm talking about here. Pretty much means often when there's not a lot of water movement, when there's no water movement at all, the fishing activity isn't all that good. So yeah, there's that little bit. So, yeah. Doing well. Cheers, mate. So yeah, the two main points I guess I've tried to make so far is, one, don't stress too much about that 40-minute period, fish either side of the tides. But the other one is you really do want to take note of the run in and the run out, and what tide it is when you're actually having success or when you're not having success. You can learn just as much from a bad session where you don't catch anything. You can learn just as much from that as you can from when you do catch a lot of fish. So I've got a lot of mates that fish the lake out here, and they do catch dew, but they complain because they went a few weeks ago and they got 3, and then they went 5 times in a row and they caught nothing. And these guys aren't like obsessed with fishing the way I am, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are. They don't care about putting that much effort in. They just knock off work and go for a fish. But I try to explain to them, what was the tide doing when you got the 3? I don't know, but I got 3, and I was like, yeah, sweet. Well, what was it doing when you got nothing 5 times in a row? I don't know, just went fishing. So I try to get through to them, like, if you take note of those things, you will notice little patterns. You will see that spot that you fish, because these guys that I'm talking about, they've got 1 or 2 spots, and they don't vary. They just smash those 1 or 2 spots every time because they've caught dew there, and they feel confident because they've caught dew in those 2 spots. They just keep going back and back and back. Sometimes they get them, sometimes they don't, and they're all right with that, I guess. But you will notice that it's probably a running tide and a northerly wind, or the opposite. You will notice certain conditions when you do catch them, and you will notice other conditions when you're not catching them. And when you start to look at things like that, you'll be able to put things into place where you go, you know what? The last 3 times I fished here on a run-out tide, I didn't get anything. The next time I'm free to go fishing and it's a run-out tide, maybe I won't go back to that spot. Maybe I'll go somewhere else. And then you will find spots that work in all different types of weather scenarios, and that's when you can start to become a little bit more consistent. So I guess now that I've talked a bit about how the tides work and the right time of the tide to be fishing, we'll take a little bit of that knowledge and apply it to Lake Macquarie, and I'll just let you guys know a few of the little things that I look for when I'm trying to position myself in a part of the lake to give myself the best chances of catching these fish. And again, obviously none of this is set in stone. We all know they're fish, they're animals. You can go out there some days when everything looks like everything's against you and you can jag a good fish. And there's other days you can go out there where everything looks perfect and nothing works and you don't get anything. But these are just these little 1%ers that I use to hopefully put myself in the best position to catch fish, because it can definitely be pretty hard out there and you need all those little 1%ers lining up. So, Johnny, do I just hit the space bar? Rightio. That's not meant to be there. So this one here. Right, so for the sake of this little bit here, I've done this really good drawing job on this map here, and I've drawn a line across here. So for the sake of this talk, let's call everywhere north of the red line the north of the lake, and everywhere south of the lake. It's basically where the drop over finishes here and goes across to Wangi, and this is pretty much like your reference point where the tide will be running in that way and in that way and then back out that way. It's sort of like the cut-off point where the tide affects each end of the lake differently. For this part of the little talk, I am referring mostly to lure fishing as well, because when I'm bait fishing and my boat's going to be fixed in an area, when I'm bait fishing, I do slightly look for different conditions compared to when my boat's going to be constantly moving through an area. So I am mostly talking about lure fishing. When I'm lure fishing, I stick to pretty much two main combos. I'll run like a 6 to 12 pound rod, pretty light for dewies, I know, but you don't need too much gear out there in the lake. There's not a lot of pylons and structure for them to get you in most of the areas. So I'll stick to a 6 to 12 pound rod with 8 pound braid, 14 pound leader. Then I'll run a heavier combo, 10 to 20 pound rod with 10 pound braid and a 16 pound leader. So yeah, this is mostly about lure fishing. This little bit here. And yeah, for the sake of this talk, I don't want to give anyone's favourite spot away, so I'm going to use this little dot, which is supposed to represent Belmont Barge, which I'm sure everybody knows. You do get dew there, but more often than not, there's more boats sitting on top of it than dewfish. But yeah, this everything I'm about to talk about now, about here, this will relate to anywhere north of the lake. So if you like fishing the tank traps or Toronto or over here at Rathmines, whatever, these are the sort of conditions I look for when I'm fishing the north end of the lake. So if my mates just told me that the dewies are on Belmont Barge, and I check the weather forecast and I see it's going to be blowing northerly, right? Now it could be northeast, northwest, it doesn't matter too much as long as the main direction is coming from the north. The next thing I'll look for is the tide. So I'm going to want to run in tide to fish this area, pretty much most of the northern end of the lake, most efficiently, okay? Now there's a fair few reasons for that. First reason is you got the barge here, you're going to have the wind behind you, so the first advantage that's going to give you is you're going to get bigger, longer casts with the wind behind you. Second is you're going to be able to use your electric motor a lot less to play around on, and when you want to get that pinpoint accurate drift straight across whatever the structure is, it doesn't have to be a wreck. This could just be a big bay full of cockle beds that you like to fish that holds fish. When you're drifting through it, you don't want to have to use the electric motor too much. You want that wind helping you, right? Now you're also going to have the tide running in. So when you're casting your lures this way, you want that tide helping your lures come back to the boat. That'll keep the lure on the bottom for longer, keep it in the strike zone for longer. It'll have your lures swimming a lot more naturally when they're coming back with the tide. If you've ever tried to pull a soft fibre or a plastic against the current or across the current, that's when you see them blow out and not look as natural. And then the other two big factors are, if you've got the tide running in this way, this is your barge here, and I've sounded up over this quite a few times, not necessarily this barge, but a lot of wrecks, and you will find with the tide running in here, the dew are most likely to be sitting on these backside here in the eddies, looking this way, and they're just waiting for squid and shrimp and prawns and that to come past, and they're ducking out, smashing them, right? So if you're drifting this way, the tide's bringing your lure back that way, you're going to be casting over the fish and hopping those lures back into their face. So you're more likely to provoke a bite when you're jigging that lure straight back into the fish's face naturally. You're also less likely to spook fish. This is about 10 metres here, and I don't worry too much about spooking them in that sort of depth, but like just yesterday I was smashing them in 5 metres, and you definitely do need to worry a bit about the the sound of the waves hitting the hull of your boat and all that when you're fishing relatively shallow for these fish. So if they're most likely going to be facing this way and you're coming from behind, you're less likely to spook those fish. Now you can see, if you were to fish it in the reverse conditions, run-in tide, a southerly wind, all those little 1%ers are going to be against you. You're going to be bringing your lures back against the current, so they're not... anyone who's tried to fish a tidal waterway or fish anywhere when there's a bit of wind, you know how hard it can be to stay in contact with that lure and see the line go slack when it hits the bottom. That's going to happen here when you're fishing those lures against the current. You've got way more chance of staying in contact, seeing those bites, working that lure more efficiently when you got that tide bringing the lure back towards the boat. So they're all the things I look for when I'm fishing pretty much anywhere north of the lake. Sure, like as I said earlier, nothing's set in stone. You could still fish it in a southerly and jam a fish, but when they're shut down, when they're not really in the mood, if you're throwing over this way and jigging it back towards their tail, not towards their head, they're all these little 1%ers. Now you've got to make the fish turn around and want to eat it. The lure's not going to stay in a strike zone for as long. All these little things just make life that little bit harder as opposed to trying to set yourself up with all those little things in your favour. So if I had a 8 a.m. tide change, so it was running in, 8 a.m. high tide, I'd structure my day up the north end of the lake more often than not. I might not fish Belmont Barge, but I'd fish various amounts of spots up the north end of the lake until I found some fish. Where are they? Oh, we'll get to that later on. That's the next session. You've got to come to the next one for that. But yeah, I need a few more beers, not waters, then I'll start giving them away. But I lost my train of thought now, Jono. Cheers, mate. So yeah, I'll get to that. One last thing. So if I had a tide change at 8 o'clock in the morning, I'd fish up north. Even if I caught a few dew, generally like the dew bite, they'll only stick around in an area if they move around a lot. They'll only stick around and bite for like 40 minutes, an hour or so, and then they'll be on the next spot. So once that tide changes at 8 o'clock in the morning, you've got to remember that's going to start running out. Everything I just talked about is going to be starting to work against me. That's when, if I've got the whole day off to go fishing, I'll probably start to move down south with this red line. And when that tide's running out, I've got the northerly wind all day. I start moving south, all those little 1%ers are going to be back in my favour again because the tide's running out. Right? So that's basically how I plan my day. Are there any questions so far before I go on to the next little bit? It doesn't have to be about what I've talked about, but just dewy fishing in general. What's that, sorry? Oh, this is the question I was dreading. Fucking hell. Yeah, so I look for, it doesn't really matter what app you use. They're all pretty much get their data from the same place. But I base everything off willy weather within the lake, and you can pick where within the lake. And honestly, it's so hard to gauge that exactly. And anywhere in the ocean, they're pretty accurate. They're 6 hours, but in the lake, you'll notice two different time gaps. You'll notice a tide where they've tried to predict like the delay, where it might only have like a 4 or 5 hour difference, and then you'll always notice the next one that's got about an 8 hour difference. Now, more often than not, that 8 hour difference one, that is relatively accurate. That 4 hour one, it's all over the place. It's never a 4 hour gap. It's so hard to predict that water running into this lake, filling up this bay here at Belmont, going all the way up to Taralba. Every single day is different. Every single day's got a different size tide. The only times I've ever had it like pinpoint knowing exactly how far the delay was years ago. I used to spend 4 nights out there every night bait fishing for dew, and you'd see that they've predicted it to be a 9 o'clock tide change, and it'd be 10:30, 11, and you'll see your lines swing out the other side of the boat, and you'd be like, oh, so it's an hour and a half. And if I was lucky enough to have the next day off and go for a spin, I'd know that it was an hour and a half. But these days, the best you can do is just aim for roughly when they're talking about and try and get your sessions a couple of hours either side of the tide change. If you do go past some of the markers on this Wanji point here, you will see like the movement of the tide going past, and you can see if it's moved on, like if it's still running in or running out. But yeah, like I don't think you'll find anyone that can tell you it's exactly this much of a delay. I think there's a 30-minute delay just from the heads to the Swansea Bridge. So you got to imagine trying to go from Swansea Bridge to Taralba, like it's insane.
Just on that point, the dive scores Swansea are pretty good at estimating it.
Yep.
Give you a delay factor.
Right.
Look at that,
Well, that's awesome. That might be something I need to look into because I I struggle to pick the delay, and it's not like the harbour, my example I gave earlier, where you could visibly see the tide as it was changing. It's when you're out in the middle fishing open ground, it can be very hard. But yeah, you just got to try and plan your trips roughly around what they predict, and see how you go. Another little, oh yeah, sorry mate, what did you?
I like fish mostly with southern end of the lake.
Yep.
A lot of the time you just can't see if there's any running off.
Yeah, the southern end of the lake, and a few of the guys from the uni were talking about this at our last odds fish thing. They talked about just how there's so much more tidal movement and circulation in the top end of the lake, and then there is down the southern end of the lake. It's definitely a lot harder to see the water moving around down there because it's so far from the drop over.
This is from Frank.
Oh, cheers, Frank. Yep.
When you sort of start getting down to Clancy way,
Yeah, oh, for sure, man.
but I still get dew there.
Yeah, yep, definitely. It's the same as like right up the top end of the lake too, like up around Taralba and stuff. I've caught dew up there plenty of times, and you don't see a lot of movement, but the dew definitely get up there.
So does your tide still work in that scenario?
It's not as important. A lot of that time they're probably just following bait, and yeah, it's definitely not as important. You won't find as many eddies. You won't find it pushing around as much. But one last thing I wanted to sort of make a point on before I go on to my sounder stuff, like the tide side of things. I've sort of finished talking about that. This is a bigger thing that I've really learnt is many years ago when I started trying to take dewy fishing seriously. I started every time I caught a dew, I'd start marking dew in my sounder, and I was trying to like work out a pattern, figure out exactly something that's going on with dew, like find a pattern with catching these dew fish, right? Year or two later, just had all these marks all over my sounder, and I was still catching lots of dew, but I was catching lots of dew, but I couldn't figure out any sort of a pattern. It was just the fact that I was spending a ton of time on the water, so I was catching all these dew. I'd go to spots and I'd be like, you know what, I've got 5 marks here. I know I caught all these dew here last winter, but it's winter now. Why aren't I catching them? And it wasn't until I thought of the last piece of the puzzle that I'd been missing out, and it's what I've been blubbering on about all night, and that's the tides. I wasn't fishing the right tides. I was fishing spots where I'd caught dew before, but I hadn't taken any note of what the tide was. So now, instead of writing dew, I've started writing run in and run out. I don't bother marking any other fish in the lake, so I don't need to write brim or dew or whatever. I just write run in, run out. Every time I catch a dew, I write run in and run out. Since doing that, I find I'll be up in the lake sometimes and I'll be fishing an area and I'll be like, I caught 3 dew here last winter. Why aren't I catching them? And I'll look at the tide and I'm like, oh, it's running out. All 3 of these say run in. So I'll scroll out on my sounder. I'll look for another clump of marks that all say whatever the tide's doing right now, and I'll go and focus on that area rather than where I'm fishing. So yeah, definitely take note of the tides. They're important. Yo. Yep.
People start thinking structure
Yep.
instead of water depth. You can get them in relatively shallow water as long as you stick to structure. I used to get them off the old bar.
Yep. Yeah, well, a long time ago, there was crystal clear water and sand up at the top end Taralba there, and there was a lot of guys talked about catching a lot of dewy up that end in the lake, but it's really silted in now. I don't know, I've only got theories, but I kind of feel like a lot of the time they're up there, they're following big schools of bait when the birds are working, you'll find them up there, but there's not a lot of proper structure like barges and wrecks and things like that they're actually holding on. When I've found them up the top end of the lake, it's generally just been me going back to the boat ramp and seeing birds and going and popping a dew out from under it. Like a lot of the spots I'll actively target them aren't so much up the top end of the lake. But I've got to wrap this up, so I'll quickly try and get through these sounder shots. I just want to give a few examples. I see a lot of people putting stuff up on the internet that, you know, asking questions about is this a dewy, is this this, or is this that, whatever, so what to look for. This here, and again, I come up with this last night. It's a bit rushed. These are just some things I quickly ripped off the sounder last night. This is a good example of inactive bait, right? So you'll find this almost anywhere in Lake Macquarie now. Going back 8 years or so, that would have got you pretty excited, and seeing something like that, it wouldn't have been, the predators wouldn't have been too far away. I've got a little bit of a theory that the guys from DPI could probably correct me on whether I'm right or wrong, but I kind of feel like Since the commercial fishing was taken out of the lake, all the the aquatic life has bounced back. You've got all the reefs that were getting demolished by the nets have bounced back. All the little bait fish have all come back. All the things that were getting caught in the nets, all the predators have come back. Everything's bounced back in a large way. We had this little period of time where it was all sort of flourishing, but as I'm sure you've all noticed, in the last sort of 10 years, recreational fishing's really kicked off. There's a lot more guys out there recreational fishing now than what there was. And why not? It's the best thing in the world. We've also noticed the huge technological advances over the last 10 years, side scan, bloody live scope, all that sort of stuff, graphite rods, fluorocarbon leaders. So there's a lot more in our favour to catch a lot more fish now. So there might not necessarily be more fish, it's just we have more tools to catch these fish these days. The one thing I want to point out is in Lake Macquarie, being a recreational fishing haven with no nets, the only thing that's under pressure at the moment are our predatory fish. No one's out there catching whitebait. No one's out there catching like the little herring and things like that. So there is a massive imbalance. There are so many bait fish out there, and the only thing that's getting taken out now are the predatory fish. So to go and find something like that is just so common in the lake now. And even when you do find the predators, they're often feeding on stuff like this, and it's like, well, why eat this plastic one when there's a million real ones right there? So, what I want to sort of get across here is, if you go find something like this in the lake, you're new to Dewey fishing, don't hang your hat on this for 40 minutes or an hour, because if you don't see the big streaks smashing through it, whether it's tailor or jewfish, it's probably not worth spending too much time there, because you'll go down to the next point and you'll find more of this sort of stuff. Next one. This here, again, not the best example. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it's a bit of an example of something I would get a bit more excited about finding this. So you got bait a bit more scattered up. You got a bit up the top, bit over here, bit over here. These are all little tailor, and they're just in there. They're causing a bit of a havoc. You can see that there's a bit more like the bait isn't just chilling in a big block, loving life. It's a bit more going on. That's more the scenario. I would put a lot more time in this scenario than I would in the previous photo. This here, I put this one in because this is a good example of some of the stuff I was talking about earlier about being really precise with working your lures into the fish's face. All those little 1%ers. This is the sort of environment where this really does come in. These are most likely dew or little snapper on some of the artificial reefs out in Lake Macquarie. You can see they're not far off the bottom. There's not a lot of bait. They're not very active. These are the ones where you do need those 1%ers. You do need your lures swimming perfectly. You do need to be casting accurately. You do want to be bringing those lures back. These are the days that are probably, when you find fish hugging the bottom like that, these are the days you probably, if you're not doing everything right, you're not going to get them. So you can see I've spot locked on top of them. Out here on the side scan, it's as simple as tapping on the screen like that, and it'll tell you 19 metres to the right, whatever. And so 90 metres, I want to put a 25 metre cast out over the top of that and hop it back with the current to give yourself the best chance of popping that lure in front of one of these Dewey's face and getting a bite. Next one, that's just a good example of tailor. I see so many people going, oh, I got the Dewey schooled up the other day and couldn't get one to bite, and they've got a photo up like that, and that's a very good example of tailor. Tailor move around a lot more erratic than jewfish. Even when you find them schooled up and they're similar sized fish, you could have 70 centimetre Deweys schooled up with 60 centimetre tailor. The main difference you'll notice, even though the fish are roughly the same size, is Deweys are a bit more chilled. Tailor are like the ADD fish of the lake or the ocean. They're just constantly carrying on, which is why they show more streaks and more erratic movements. Deweys will show a much harder return because they don't often move as fast, not until it's game time. They'll rely on the tailor to do the hard yards, rounding up the bait fish, doing all the hard work, and the Deweys will either sit under them, picking up the scraps, or they'll wait till, as I said, the hard work's been done, then they'll start smashing into the bait fish. That's just another photo of tailor and possibly a couple of dew at the back there. Now this is one of my favourite ones. This is one of the first times I took my new boat out, and I think it's a pretty good example of some tailor here moving erratically. And I was catching 60 centimetre tailor, and I caught 3 jewfish around 70, 75 centimetres this day. So I knew what I was interpreting on the sounder was pretty accurate because I was catching it. So these are your tailor moving around. They're a bit in front, and they're doing all the hard yards. And you can see they're a bit more streaky, bit further off the bottom. And these are like the solid more boomerangs. This is because they're not carrying on. When they go under that cone under your sounder, they're just like cruising through. They're not moving around as erratic, so they show like a more solid shape. That's why I've included that one. I think that's a pretty good example. I only got a couple more, I promise, and this is where some more people can get some lures. Mostly the local guys might know these ones. This is a little bit of a guessing game. Can anyone tell me what this is? It's one of the common artificial structures that the council or government have put in. It's not the artificial reefs. That's what the other one was. Not the seaplane, no. I've already talked about it tonight too. Barge, who said barge? Who said Belmont barge? Whoever said Belmont barge, yep, that's the one. So yeah, that's Belmont barge. Right, next one here. This is an interesting one. I know I've fished this spot with people in the room, so if they haven't taken note of it, shame on you. But not same end of the lake as Belmont barge. Can anyone tell me what this one is? Here's another photo of it as well. And the biggest tip is its name. Like I got told about this spot by a real old school fisherman. It's been known for many years in the lake, and people have fished this since before we had this sort of technology. So it's named after a boat that people thought it was. Who said that? You ruined it. Someone else, not him. So it's named after an old school boat, and it turns out now that we've got side scan and live scan, all these sort of stuff, we can tell that it's, I don't even know what it is. It looks like a bloody big concrete ladder, but anyone else recognise this one? Titanic. You have to give it to Reevesy. It's it's called a Bertram. Everyone thought this was a big sunken Bertram for many years, and then we got past the sonar sort of technology and got this sort of stuff, and now we can see. I honestly don't even know what it is, but they're just big concrete slabs with like little concrete things in between, and Jewies love it. So, all right, this is my last one, and I promise, and you can all get another beer. These things, I was started to find these around the lake a lot, and I found it really hard to interpret. Is this a bloody like a rock, a lump, or is this a divot? And I even sent Lawrence a message. I've got a fair few different images. I've got some better images of it too. I just couldn't find them. And Lawrence literally said, "Flip a coin." I don't know. And then they said it could be either, and I was like, rightio. And then I started to find them in other spots around around big wrecks, and I started to notice these things. And like the first time I went there, I saw a couple of them, and then next time I went back, there was 5 or 6 more. And then what dawned on me, these are the marks that anchors leave in the sand, the big divots that it leaves when someone anchors on a wreck. That's why I started to see more and more of them appearing around big, well-known wrecks on the lake every time people anchor up around them. So I just thought that was another interesting thing. You will probably see them if you spend a lot of time on your side scan. You'll see them all over the place. But thanks for putting up with my awkward little speech.